And thank you all so much for being here, and particularly to my great friends and colleagues, Penny Mordaunt, Anne-Marie Morris and Tim Lawton, who've come along as part of Fresh Start. So we're here today to kick off a totally new strand to the EU referendum debate. New to the debate, but in fact the culmination of work that began nearly 5 years ago in September 2011. Back then, 124 Conservative MPs, including a good sprinkling of government ministers, got together to launch the Fresh Start project. Its ambition was huge, and we believe quite unique in parliamentary terms. It had 3 aims. First, to look in great detail at every aspect of the EU and how it affects Britain today, not just for the UK, but for all member states. And third, to travel around the EU, and of course around Whitehall too, evangelising about our ideas, and through sheer weight of evidence, deliver the change the EU needs. We took hundreds of hours of evidence. We published several papers, we met dozens of EU politicians, Commission officials, and European ambassadors, all culminating in a 2-day EU reform conference held with the excellent Open Europe think tank and with our own Chancellor, George Osborne, as keynote speaker, as well as with lots of positive contributions from top EU politicians. We thought we'd done so well. When the Prime Minister gave his Bloomberg speech promising a renegotiation followed by a referendum, it felt like a huge opportunity for real, fundamental reform. Support from our side was near unanimous. We published the Fresh Start mandate for reform, and here's one I prepared earlier. I have all my props here to show you, and there's some of these available afterwards if anybody wants to have a look at it. The mandate for reform. It was a brief summary that even someone with only the most basic knowledge of the issues could understand. It proposed 22 structural reforms that would have transformed the EU, but left its core ambitions intact. Now, I'm a huge supporter of David Cameron, and I genuinely have nothing but praise for his efforts at convincing other EU leaders to accept the need for reform. But did we get anything like the sort of reform that would make the EU work better? No, not even close. And worse, even with the certainty of a UK referendum following the negotiation, it's clear that there was no appetite whatsoever amongst European leaders for anything more than a few minor concessions. So you can imagine the disappointment of so many MPs at the choice that now lay before us. Accept a largely unreformed EU, where we have no control over the knock-on effects of Eurozone integration and the EU migration crisis, or choose the route of freedom and democracy, in, of course, the certain knowledge of an almighty battle ahead with an establishment who would stop at nothing to scare voters into submission. So I can tell you most, although not all, of the Fresh Start team have now chosen to take back control on June the 23rd, and I applaud them for that. I truly believe the UK's best days lie ahead of us as an independent, free-trading, globally competitive nation. The facts are absolutely on our side. We speak the world's international business language, our contract law is world-class, our judicial system is one of the least corrupt in the world, our economy is the world's 5th largest, behind only the US, China, Japan and Germany. London, home to 9 million people, has had top ranking for the last 4 years in a row on the Global Power City Index. And of course there's the Commonwealth of 2.2 billion consumers, where much of the world's fastest economic growth is taking place, and where huge opportunities lie for new British trade links. And it's not just our economic achievements that point to a bright future. The Times World University Rankings includes 3 UK universities in its top 10. We're a founding member of NATO. We hold one of the 5 permanent seats on the UN Security Council. Leaving the EU won't change any of that, and we will continue to have the 4th largest military budget in the world. So the battle is joined, and the Fresh Start project has turned its attention away from reform ideas and instead to answering the question on everyone's lips: What does it mean if we leave the EU? So we plan to publish over the next couple of weeks a series of papers on what leaving the EU might look like across all sorts of policy areas. We'll be talking about how remaining in the EU will affect us in different policy areas. We'll be talking about how the transition period of our exit might look, and then a flavour of what our options will be once we get back our freedom to choose. And today, as Energy Minister, I want to kick off by talking about my own sector. So it's well known that there are three critical considerations that are always at the forefront of our energy policy, often referred to as the energy trilemma. They are keeping the lights on, keeping the cost of bills down, and moving to a clean energy future. And the fact is that we are world leaders in the development of new low-carbon technologies. Not only that, but our emissions reduction ambitions set out in our UK Climate Change Act of 2008 are world leading, certainly EU leading. So let me be very clear, absolutely none of this is threatened by the UK voting to leave the EU on June the 23rd. Put simply, the lights will not go out, bills will not go up, and decarbonisation will not stall as a result of leaving the EU. Where electricity and gas are concerned, ongoing security of supply will always be a red line for the UK, and I want to briefly address both. The truth is that the vast majority of our electricity is in fact homegrown, and we've made enormous strides towards lowering our carbon emissions. In fact, 24% of our electricity now comes from renewable sources. The electricity we get from elsewhere, both from countries in the EU and beyond, is through interconnectors, privately owned by companies. So let's be very clear here. Businesses do business with each other, and the electricity flows through interconnectors in the most profitable direction, so everyone benefits. Nobody can reasonably claim that our electricity would somehow be switched off by a European politician trying to punish the UK for voting to leave. That's not going to happen. But even more vital than electricity to our economy is our use of gas. Over 80% of us use gas for heating and cooking, and again, the UK is on a very secure supply footing. There is a global wholesale market with plentiful sources of liquefied natural gas, totally unrelated to membership of a political bloc. 40% of the UK's own gas supplies come from our own North Sea gas reserves, with the rest mostly coming from Norway and the Middle East. Last time I looked, none of those were in the EU. Unlike some other EU member states, we are not dependent on Russia for our gas. But, and this is a huge but, what those who are on the Remain side must answer is this: how will you deal with the very real threat our continued membership of the EU will have on our energy security? And here's the rub. The European Commission's winter package, here's the press release, contains a number of proposals which make painfully clear the direction of travel in EU energy policy. Two of those suggestions pose a potential threat to our continued energy security. First, we will be required in future to ask the Commission for approval before negotiating new gas deals with international partners, leaving us possibly reliant on a group of unelected Eurocrats, further diminishing our freedom to act in our own best interests and certainly delaying our ability to respond in an emergency. But secondly, and of perhaps the greatest concern, there is a specific proposal by the Commission to require Member States to take on legal responsibility for each other's gas security. To quote directly from the Commission's report that I just waved at you, the Commission's report, anyone who wants to see it, available afterwards. This is the quote: "Under the so-called solidarity principle, an EU country in trouble would see gas supplies to its households and essential services ensured by neighbouring EU countries. That's the end of the quote. There's a lot more in the press release. So the wording is clear. If we remain to become part of the energy union and another member state faces problems with their gas security, perhaps because of a political dispute with a supplier, we will be required to deprive our own small businesses of energy here at home. Now, whilst we already do have a voluntary arrangement and takes control entirely out of our hands, the tragedy is that this has always been a red line for us. As we always say, energy security in the UK is not negotiable. But it appears this will soon change. And what's more, the decision will be taken under qualified majority voting, which means we have virtually no chance of resisting it. Just as we're penalised by the EU when our economy does well by having our EU budget contributions revised upwards, of the very fact that we have worked so hard to ensure it. These issues should matter to every family and every business, and I think gives a strong push towards the path of freedom, democracy and self-determination. So, what if we leave? Are there benefits for our energy policy? Well, as I've set out this morning, remaining in the EU carries big risks, whilst leaving the EU doesn't threaten any of our energy goals. So now to the opportunities of a vote to leave. There is an area of energy policy where leaving really could help the UK bill payer, and that is in getting away from the huge restrictions of EU state aid rules. We've seen only recently how help for our steel sector is subject to EU state aid, making it not only difficult but also painfully slow to save our steel. We've also seen how the EU's control over VAT levels has meant the Treasury having to hold a review of VAT on solar panels, with a proposal to raise it upwards from 5% to 20%. If we refuse to do it, they can take us to court. And less well known, but a huge thorn in my side every single day, is the need to get EU state aid approval if we want to make any policy choices about our energy mix. So the capacity market that ensures our electricity supply, the contracts for difference auctions that support new renewables, even our new nuclear ambitions, all have to be approved under EU state aid, a process that can take months and even years, leaving us unable to efficiently address issues of value for money for the bill payer. Leaving the EU will give us freedom to keep bills down, to meet our climate change targets in the cheapest way possible, and of course to keep the lights on. So this then is the first in the series of Fresh Start assessments of the reality of voting to leave. I and my Fresh Start colleagues believe that the UK has a superb future waiting for us outside the EU. We will be doing everything we possibly can to convince our fellow voters to choose the path of independence and democracy by voting Leave on June the 23rd. Thank you.
What are you doing about clean coal energy? Number one. Number two, to Penny, really the compact between the individual and the state is that the individual gives up a little bit of his individuality and the state agrees to defend him. I hope that that will continue. Nothing else, but deeply important.
Well, I'll take the first question and Penny will take the second. So, as you'll know, we've made a policy decision that we want to take coal off our electricity generation system by 2025. And of course, wherever possible, we want to use clean coal in the meantime. But nevertheless, the fact is that we do want to meet our legally binding decarbonisation goals, which are set out in UK law, nothing to do with our membership of the EU. And so everything that we do is geared towards that. So the deployment of renewables, better efficiency, reducing energy demand, demand and so on, all of our policies are geared towards decarbonising at the lowest possible cost. Penny.
Thank you. Fresh Start has done a huge amount of work on both security and defence issues and the justice issues that surround them and enable them. I think what is absolutely critical is that whatever we are doing in austere times is making a tangible difference to our security and our resilience as a nation, and that includes our energy security as well. We are going to be talking about all these issues in the future, but what concerns me is the EU, through A, the rulings from the European Court, and B, because what it is requiring us to do in terms of limiting the security relationships that we would want, and also tying up some of our defence assets into things which make no tangible difference to our security at all. And we can see, I think, the debate and the concern that is being expressed from a number of people in the defence and security community about the EU and its ambitions to expand in how it's trying to tackle the migrant crisis, that it's not giving its member states the tools it needs to do that. We have to take back control, particularly of our borders, but also the operational freedom we need, whether it's protecting the UK or whether it's allowing our servicemen and women overseas to conduct operations as they require. Currently, we are being barred from doing that, and that is going to be a topic that Fresh Start's done a lot of work on, and we're going to be talking about in the weeks to come.
Yeah, the gentleman there, the front, middle, that's it, thanks.
Hi, Jason Gross from the Daily Mail. Could I ask you just to spell it out a little bit on security of supply? We've heard quite a bit from the other side about Vladimir Putin and how if we leave he might turn our gas supplies off. The scenario you're talking about really here is if he threatens one of the EU member states, isn't it? And secondly, could I ask you just to flesh out this idea that somehow leaving might help us improve the ability to get our energy bills down? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So essentially on the gas security, that's exactly right. The intention behind the EU's proposal is to try and help, no doubt, our further East European member states to be able to have guaranteed gas security come what may. And obviously that's an admirable wish, but again, the question for us, we have gone to great lengths to ensure our own energy security, and we have always said that in policy terms it is a red line, we're not going to put that at risk. But here comes an EU proposal just this year that's up for discussion that puts that at risk, and I think that's incredibly damaging for our energy security. And the reality is, should it be called upon, it does mean that we will have to restrict our own supply of gas. And that is the point. So it's not as if it's a free option. What it's saying, and it does go on to say further in the winter package, and Maris Sefcovic has made clear, it does mean potentially us switching off our businesses in order to provide essential services elsewhere. Now, some people might say, well, that's a great thing to do, share and share alike. But what I would say is we've gone to great lengths to ensure energy security in this country, and we should not be putting it at risk because others haven't done so. You know, that is our first duty, is to our own people. And your second point was about getting bills down. So, you know, it's very difficult as a poor, simple energy minister who isn't given access to any of the departmental resources to fight this David and Goliath fight, you'll notice. And so I'm kind of here out on a limb. So in terms of am I able to do the precise analysis on the impact on bills of not having to deal with EU state aid, I'm afraid I can't tell you that I've been able to command the resources to do that work, but you could certainly ask the Treasury what work they've done on it. But I think the key point here is it's quite obvious to anybody who is in business or anybody who is running anything that if you've got somebody breathing down your neck, so to take a concrete example, the feed-in tariffs review, we had to review the subsidies because it was costing bill payers far more than we expected it to cost them. So we wanted to review that to get the subsidies to a fair level, fair to investors, but also fair to consumers who are having to foot the bill. And so what we wanted to do was to consider all of the options. But the truth is, had we decided that we wanted to completely exclude some elements of the subsidy, so perhaps to one category of renewable, that would have required EU state aid approval. And that would have taken months, if not years, to get, and it would have meant we couldn't make any changes to the feed-in tariffs in the meantime. So effectively that limited our policy options. And that, I think, is the key challenge, is how do you put a price on that? It's difficult to say, but what it does do is it limits our ability to do what we believe is in the best interests of bill payers. And I want to be very clear here. I had 25 years in finance. I totally get the need for investor confidence in these things. But at the same time, when we have people in this country dying because of fuel poverty, unable to heat themselves, then we've got to ensure that balance. And we choose in the Energy Department, Amber and I and Lord Bourne, we choose to be the consumer champion. We want to put consumers first, so we want to keep the bills down. And what EU state aid rules do is to limit our ability to do that. Yes, the other gentleman here, and then there.
Thank you. One for Ben Riley-Smith from The Telegraph. One for Penny Mordaunt, if I might. Picking up on what you said earlier, if I understood it correctly, were you saying the EU, as it currently stands, is undermining our ability to tackle the migrant crisis? And if so, does that have knock-on consequences for our security, given fears about extremists coming in via that crisis? And secondly, for anyone, there have been discussions today from some people on your team about whether they would carry on pushing for another referendum if the In campaign wins. Could you guys confirm that, even if it is a tight result, you will respect it and not push for a second referendum?
So Penny, and then Tim will take the second one.
Thank you. So the migrant crisis, I mean, clearly much of it is driven by the war in Syria, but there are many other factors as well, poverty and so forth. It is a complex situation. I would argue that I don't think the structures of the EU have added anything to the countries in Europe being able to address the situation. But the key point is that they are creating an additional crisis out of the migrant crisis, and indeed their future ambitions to expand the EU. You can't deal with a crisis like the migrant crisis or consider expansion unless you give member states the tools they need to protect their own citizens. And currently we do not have that. We do not have full control of our borders. We have to apply different thresholds to those people coming from the UK that have coming from the EU who have a documentation from the EU, even if we have deep concerns over how they actually obtained that documentation. So things like the ZZ case, for example, which mean that we can't, if we have serious concerns, but they're not about an immediate threat, that we are on dodgy legal ground excluding that individual. I think there are other aspects as well, the chipping away at our ability to share information with our Five Eyes partners, share information outside the European Economic Zone. Why is that terrific for us and terrific for Europe? Of course it's not. It's really undermining our security. And again, in this, as in so many areas, we have the EU with the authority, but none of the responsibility at all. And it is the first duty and responsibility of any government to protect its citizens. And I, as a defence minister, and the security minister feels the same way, as does our human rights minister, that we need more tools to do that. There is not just the threat now, 5,000 Daesh-trained fighters in Europe, according to Europol. It's what's coming over the horizon as well. And this vote is our last chance to say no. We want to have better control. We want to take back that control and protect our citizens.
And to push that time, the point is we can't stop any of those. We are less able to stop those 5,000 and others coming into the country in the EU.
Absolutely. So let me give you an example. If we have security concerns about an individual because of their connections, we have to be confident that they present a serious and present threat. It can't just be that we've got sketchy information about somebody, but serious concerns. We have to provide a higher level of proof about our concerns on that individual. And what we're asking our intelligence and security services to do is almost an impossible task. They do an amazing job. We know, because of the foiled plots certainly that are in the public domain, what a terrific job they're doing. But we are putting so much of a burden on them. I want to enable them to focus on fewer individuals, and to do that we need to be able to have more control at our own borders. And I hope as well, as you can see towards the end of the Prime Minister's renegotiation, that where we might lead on that, others might follow, because I would want the remainder of the EU to have better internal and external border security.
Let me take the referendum question. Let's be absolutely clear. This is a one-off. There is not going to be another referendum. Referendums are not like London buses. You wait 41 years for one to come along and then several will come at once. And so that's why it's really important that either side accepts the decision on June the 24th and we move on. I'm speaking for myself and Fresh Start members. We are battling hard. That's why the next 5 weeks are going to be so important. We're not going to have another shot at this. This is the once-in-a-generation opportunity for the British public to have their say on who runs this country in the future. It's likely to be a close result. If it's a few points to remain, we will accept that and we will move on. We've got things to do with running this country over the next few years. The referendum campaign has perhaps at times been a distraction from that. There are other things that we need to do. And similarly, I hope that the vote Remain side will accept the verdict of the British people on June the 23rd as well, and make sure that any transition that will therefore come of it is done in as smooth and effective a way as possible. But I think what is really important is that we have a good turnout for this referendum, that people feel engaged, that people feel that they have got the information to make a value judgment, a balanced judgment as to what is best for their interests, and then go out and vote so we can put this to bed for once and for all. We've had an uneasy relationship in Britain with the EEC and then the EU for 43 years now. It's time we ended that uncertainty one way or the other, and that's why it's so important we accept the verdict on June the 24th and move on.
Thanks, yeah. Gentleman here and the lady at the back.
Hi, John Ashmore from Politics Home. The Chancellor said yesterday that there isn't a conspiracy, there's a consensus, and that's why they've been able to marshal so many international bodies behind the Remain case. What do you put it down to? Is it a conspiracy or a consensus? And why?
I put it down to a big institutional ganging up on the poor British voter, actually. You know, it's extraordinary how... what do they have in common, these organisations? Number one, lots of EU funding, and number two, they're all rich, successful, and either way won't bother me, mate. The people who it will bother are the British voters, who are the people who have to make the decision. We've already heard from the Remain camp that the big problem with leaving the EU is that pay for British workers will go up. How is that a bad thing for British workers? I don't think you'll be hearing that from them. What we also know for a fact is that as things stand, people are really struggling because of competition. So at the lower end, the Bank of England just last year showed pay has been suppressed at the lower end for British workers. Jobs are being displaced at the lower end for British workers. We know people are struggling to get their children into a decent primary school. We all know the NHS is desperately creaking. We all know that the housing market is overblown, not enough houses available for the demand of people who want to move into them. So there is no doubt that these comfortable individuals, i.e. the establishment who are so determined to tell you what's good for you, have no idea. They have no skin in the game, and it's the British voter who is going to be making their decision. Lady at the back. Yeah, lady at the back there. Mm.
Hello, I've got a quick two-part question. I try to convert people to our way of thinking, and on the way here, the taxi driver said to me, this government, if we go out of Europe, or if we go out of Europe, then all the laws that they've made, employment laws that are good for people in this country, they throw them out and make life worse. The second one is more personal. My daughter is high up in BlackRock, and I'm trying to persuade her. I've persuaded one of my children, but there's no chance with her, so please give me some ammunition.
Okay. Great questions. Anne-Marie's going to take the first one, I'll take the second one. Thanks.
Right, the taxi driver. Well, I think as far as the taxi driver is concerned, point one, she's wrong. There isn't going to be this enormous change whereby suddenly, overnight, on the 24th of June, all the protection, employment protection, is going to go. If you actually look at our record as a country, we have done more than we have been required to do. If you look at parental leave, etc., we are the ones ahead of the game. So it is, I'm afraid, rubbish to say that suddenly there is going to be a bonfire of employment protection. What you need in any country is good working relationships between the employer and the employee. It would do nobody any good to start changing those good working relationships by simply tearing up all those regulations. There are other regulations which clearly do need to be sorted, but employment law is very important, and we need to ensure we keep our employees feeling engaged. Thank you.
Yes, quite right. Yeah, so just on the subject of a BlackRock employee, it's an area that has been so, fraught, this passporting, magical word. Passporting basically means you can either do business somewhere without a subsidiary or you can't. Now, a subsidiary could be a little brass plate for which you pay 250 quid a year. So are people seriously saying that Goldman Sachs would not pay the 250 quid and in fact would stop doing any business with Europe rather than pay the 250 quid? And that was always assuming that they didn't already have a subsidiary in Europe. I mean, passporting is such rubbish. It's the biggest red herring. Next time anyone talks about passporting, just blow them a big raspberry. It's a total red herring. It's become this magical word. So the key point about financial services is the UK, it's not the city, it's the United Kingdom. We have 2 million people employed in financial services if you include the financial services professions such as accounting and law and so on. 1 million if you just look at traders and fund managers and insurance brokers and so on. Now, of those million, some of them are in the city, others are in Aberdeen, Edinburgh, Birmingham, Manchester, Bournemouth, Northampton, you name it, widespread across the UK. Now, what are we seriously saying here? That they're all going to up sticks and move to Europe? Canary Wharf alone is much bigger than the downtown financial services district in Frankfurt. The UK is the world's top financial services centre. We compete with New York, Hong Kong and Singapore. And you really have to follow the money. HSBC, Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, base themselves in London. Every few years they review that. Shall we go to Hong Kong? Shall we go to Shanghai? Shall we stay in London? A couple of months ago, full knowledge of a referendum, they decided to stay in London. Follow the money. Deutsche Börse is looking at merging with the London Stock Exchange. Where would they base themselves? London. Follow the money. The point is that the UK financial services has a massive talent pool, huge international quality. London is, as I've said, the best city on earth for 4 years in a row. Who's going to want to go outside of London for talent pool reasons, for culture, for lifestyle, for English, for contract law, for lack of corruption in the judicial system, for the expertise? There's no reason to leave London or the United Kingdom, and they simply won't. Absolutely, read my lips here. The city, UK financial services, is going precisely nowhere, whether we stay or go. Yes, lady in the second row.
At a Spectator EU event a couple of weeks ago, the pro-Remain MPs who were there were asked what the biggest sole benefit of remaining in the EU was, and Nick Clegg said safety in numbers. I kind of want to ask the same question to each of you. What do you believe are the biggest benefit actually single of the UK leaving the EU? Each of you.
Okay, the biggest single benefit. I mean, Well, my answer to that is there is one which is very practical, and that is a £10 billion a year independence dividend. So that is the net figure. Let's not argue about these numbers. Even the Remain side admit we spend £10 billion net every year on the EU. £10 billion is the amount of money we've promised to the NHS to meet their needs to stay on the rails over this entire Parliament. We could give it to them in 1 year. Or, alternatively, we could have had no austerity if we'd left the EU in 2010. We could have just paid for it with our £10 billion a year dividend. This is a vast sum of money. So I'm going to go with that very practical reason. I'll leave my colleagues to give you the others. There's lots of them.
Ladies first.
For me, it's freedom, the freedom for every one of our citizens to reach their full potential, and the absolute foundation for that is national security. Currently, we don't have the tools to deal with the current threat. We sure as hell don't have the tools to deal with the threat that is coming over the horizon. So that absolutely, for me, as you'd expect, in defence, is my prime motivation.
And mine would be for small businesses to get rid of the bureaucracy that stops them being successful. It is our small businesses which are absolutely the place where growth is in this country. Over 90% of our businesses are small businesses, very different to what we have in Germany, and they are strangled by red tape. I want our country to grow, I want it to thrive, and for those who say, as I think is being suggested, that we can only do this together, I'm afraid I don't agree that we have to be bound in a political union to do that. Give people the opportunity, give them the ability to freely go out and make opportunities. They'll do it. That's my answer.
Yeah.
Well, I agree with all of that, but I think the biggest plus is to re-engage with the rest of the world. I mean, I just don't buy this isolationist argument. There are 7.4 billion people that live on this planet. 500 million of them happen to live within the EU. So actually going and doing a bit more with the other 6.9 billion people on this planet doesn't strike me as isolationist. It strikes me as re-engaging with the rest of the world. We need to be out there trading freely in our interests with those countries that we cannot trade with unless we're part of an EU deal. It just seems nonsense to me that we have been isolationist within the EU, where we are spending an increasing amount of time sitting around tables in Brussels, making it increasingly difficult for our member states to be able to do business with the rest of the world. And that's why we're responsible for a shrinking part of the world's economy and world's trade. We have a great heritage and experience of being a global power and a country with great experience of dealing and trading with the rest of the world. We are being held back from doing that. British people are global, they're not just continental, and that's what we will get back by setting ourselves free and taking back control on June the 23rd.
Yeah. So we've obviously persuaded you all then, you've run out of questions. Well, thank you again all very much for coming. It's been great for us. And just to say again, Fresh Start Project, a series of speeches, articles and papers on what leaving will look like after June the 23rd. And so please do look out for them. You'll be hearing a lot more from us over the next couple of weeks. Thanks again for coming. Have a great day.
You didn't frankly have the balls to put country before party.